Welcome back to Wake Up with Nubian Tigers Talk, a podcast brought to you by a group of Black Princetonians where we talk about issues impacting our Black communities. With me today, as always, is my co-host, Ray Smalls. And Ray, I understand you have a good program worked up for us today because this is our last show before our holiday hiatus. So tell us what's going on. I'm excited to hear what you got cooked up.
Well, Michelle, we had a show with your expertise back, on the law and abuse for women and so on and so forth. So we're going to hit my area, which is sports, television sports, professional sports for the most part. And to do that, I'm going to invite my good buddy, Mike Claiborne. And Mike and I reached a milestone this year where each of us have been in the sports broadcasting industry for 40 years. But Mike's done it more on a local level in the St. Louis area. And Mike's broadcast career began at KMOX in February of '81. And he co-hosted a show called Sports Open Line, believe it or not. And his various broadcast roles in the St. Louis market have consisted of being a color analyst, a play-by-play guy, a studio analyst, and a sideline reporter for St. Louis University basketball, Missouri St. Louis basketball, St. Louis Blues hockey for all you hockey fans. And he used to work with the former St. Louis Rams, which they're now back in LA, and Fox Sports Midwest and the St. Louis Baseball Cardinals. So this is his 15th year as a part of the St. Louis radio broadcast team with former Cardinal players Mike Shannon, John Rooney, and Ricky Horton. And he has covered St. Louis World Series teams in 04, 06, 11, and 13. And in addition to all of his broadcast duties, he makes the time to write a column for Town and Style magazine. So let's welcome Mike to the program.
Welcome to the show, Mike. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, Mike, it's been a long time coming, man. I've always wanted to try to get you on our show, and now we have you. So let's just dive right into it, man. And, in response to the social activism, that was going on last year for both the NBA and the WNBA, which, those two leagues use their power to create a lot of change within the league. And from your vantage point, do you think that the power relationship between owners and players, particularly Black players, do you think it's changed at all? And if it's changed, how so?
Well, I think it's changed depending on the sport. I think the NBA, the players wield a lot of power, and the owners are certainly respectful of that. When you think about a league that's made up of over 80% of players of color, the owners have to pay attention. And I think that they really kind of came together. And I think you also have to take into account a lot of the owners in the NBA are younger, more in tune with society than what we see in the NFL and certainly Major League Baseball. So I think that they've made some significant moves in the right direction. Obviously not enough, but when you go back and think about, we had an entire generation that included the likes of Michael and Charles and guys like that. They didn't have to speak out. They didn't, everything was good. I mean, they were making a lot of money. There were no social issues. I mean, I think the only time.
Well, Mike, let's not get that wrong. There were always.
Well, no, what I mean, well, they just wouldn't address it. They wouldn't address it.
Okay, yeah,
and I give you a good example. If you remember the guy who was running for governor or was a senator in North Carolina, and Michael didn't want to have anything to do with it and his line was, Republicans buy Nikes as well.
Right.
And once he checked out of that hotel, it kind of gave everybody else cover as well. This generation has decided they're going to take up some things. And, you have to tip your cap to LeBron. I mean, he's financially secure and he put his money where his mouth was about a lot of things. I mean, you think about all the things he's done in his home state of Ohio in education. This is a guy who was a pretty good example, a parent, a husband. You never heard his name in scandal or anything along that line. So he had enough cachet to really speak out. It became contagious. You had some other younger players who decided that they wanted to step forward in what I would deem a respectful manner, because we have to always take this into account. Protests are designed to make people uncomfortable, okay? So in how you do it, you can have a sign, you can march, you can do whatever, or you don't do anything, but as long as you're getting that person's attention, then mission is certainly moving toward accomplishment.
Well,
So,
let me jump in for a second, Ray.
Go ahead.
The Atlanta WNBA players, though, they were talking about making people uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah, and they had no fear. They had no fear, to the point where they went against their owner.
Right.
Yep.
One of the partial owners of the team, where she had to eventually sell her share. She ended up losing her seat in politics. And I really commend those women for stepping up in the manner they did. And they were unified to the T. You were Black, you were white, you were European. It didn't make a difference. They stayed together, and they had a voice unlike anything we've ever seen for females in sports. I mean, because the only time we've seen women in sports really speak out, they were individuals. They maybe were tennis players, or they were in track and field. They were doing something on an individual basis. Seldom did we ever see a team that eventually became a league come together. And I think they all felt like they shared the same strife with respect to how they had been treated as females compared to how they're being treated as minorities. And I think that they were able to mesh the two. They understood what was going on, and I think they took full advantage of it, and I think they made the world a little bit better.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a league, I have been totally impressed with the women of the WNBA. I mean, they really have, put a footstep. They've stepped into all of these social activism issues that have been going on, or even before George Floyd. But once George Floyd hit, they took off in a different direction. But so now let's look at, Mike, some not so prominent sports, or at least maybe not so prominent in the Black community, such as hockey, NASCAR, Formula One. And in a show of support for Bubba Wallace, right? You had all these white drivers that walked out to the starting line with him when it was reported that there was a noose found in his garage prior to that event. Do you think that white athletes' show of support is just a one-off? In other words, okay, well, everybody's doing this all during the George Floyd protest, so we're going to jump on the bandwagon? Or do you think the white athlete support is going to continue in the overall fight for racial justice?
I think for one of the few times they've taken a positive step, and really it happened by what I would call a mistake when Drew Brees came out and made those comments about the flag, and one of his teammates was like, "Yo, man, that's not how this is all about." And Drew Brees was the poster child for white involvement in protests, because once he figured out what was going on, all of a sudden the rest of the white players in the NFL, Roger Goodell, came clean and admitted that they made a mistake. He basically turned against Donald Trump and dispelled that myth that he was permeating. So there were a lot of things that Drew Brees did by mistake because he didn't know. And one of my things is, I think what it's done is created more conversation within locker rooms where guys are like, "Yo, man, I'm white. Tell me what this is all about, because I'm missing something here." And so when you have conversation like that, I think it really proved to be beneficial, not only from an educational standpoint where everybody understood what was going on, but I think it brought a lot of teammates together. Now, everybody didn't buy in on it. You're going to have certain guys who were like, won't believe it, or they had another method of how they wanted to deal with this. But I think overall, if nothing else, when that player came home and sat with his family, he was more in tune to kind of give a more objective view of what really is going on in the world compared to what he had heard or read from somebody who was ill-informed or who had another agenda.
And the interesting thing that there is that it only takes one white, well-known athlete to make a big impression on people. So, for example, when Megan Rapinoe decided to take a knee during the women's national soccer event, and it was on TV, right? She got a lot of it. She brought an awful lot of attention. And this was before George Floyd. She was doing it in support of Colin Kaepernick when Colin first started doing it. And so, and Megan Rapinoe is not in a professional sport per se, right? But because of her exposure during the Olympics and the team,
World
the
Cup,
women's team doing so well, World Cup, right? She brought a lot of attention to that issue.
Well, I certainly tip my cap to her. And as you mentioned, being a white female certainly helped get this conversation to second base, to coin another sport. And it takes people who already had experienced things from a sexuality standpoint, where, you know, she knew how to be subjected, or she knew how it was to be subjected to ridicule and scorn for the wrong reasons because of the ill-informed or the insecure. I think a lot of these things that unfold is because you have a collection of people who are insecure and thinking it's going to amount to something else that's going to affect them. You know, it's almost like, you know, when Vietnam, boy, you know what, if it's Vietnam today, it's Cambodia tomorrow, it's Hawaii the next week, you know, the whole communist thing that we all were programmed in thinking that we got to stop them here, because if not, they'll be in Nevada by next month. So, you know, it's one of those situations where people who are ill-informed and insecure, they spread it, they continue to grow it, they water it to the point where you just say enough is enough. So it's been commendable for her to do that. But I'll tell you some other people. I'm going to give Adam Silver a lot of credit here, the commissioner of the NBA, and Gary Bettman. And Gary Bettman is a commissioner of the National Hockey League. And the NHL was right there in front. They respected their players of color really better than what we saw in the NFL at one point. So, but I think it's all about leadership and being good listeners. And, you know, obviously Adam Silver understood what the bigger picture was. And I give him a lot of credit. And if you notice, a lot of other commissioners kind of came on board after that.
Yeah, we had some Black hockey players on the New Jersey Devils way back.
Yeah, Kevin Weeks, I know them all. I'm a huge hockey guy. So
so it's interesting to see the hockey environment responding. Well, and actually, some of the Black hockey players in Canada are having a worse time now than our own players here.
Yeah,
you know, you make a great point. We're having a real influx of Black players that are making legitimate contributions. You go back to last year, the number 2 player in the draft was African American or Canadian, African Canadian. The New York Rangers have a top draft choice playing defense. We now have a person of color who is doing the broadcast on radio for the new expansion team, the Seattle Kraken.
Nice.
And they have their color analyst is a player of color on TV. So this is a sport that has become more progressive. And I think that they figured out we need to target the kids. And, you know, if you, the more people that you see who look like you, the more engaging your sport's going to be. Now, when I played, I wasn't, you won't see me at the Hockey Hall of Fame, but when I played, there was nobody around that was, you know, that looked like me. But it was something I wanted to do. And, you know, I continue to enjoy the sport. But I think commissioners have had a lot to do with the progress. And granted, I know they like to see it more. What they really would like to do, can we just all go back and play? It's not that easy anymore. You know, there's just too many social issues that come into play that affect players on and off the playing surface.
And Michelle, if you ever saw Mike and I together in St. Louis talking at a restaurant or a bar or whatever about hockey, we'd be the only 2 Black people in that place talking about this sport.
Probably on the whole block.
Hey, you know what? I saw after the Olympics, I saw an African kid who plays water polo. And he made an announcement. He was saying, look, we can play any sport we want to play. We just have to get the equipment and get access and an opportunity, but we can do anything.
Well, we now have a female, African-American female diver who just won a World Cup. So, I mean, you're right. You know what? You show us and we'll take it from there.
Right.
You give us a chance.
If you've ever traveled in Africa and you see those kids doing Olympic gymnastics on an old mattress, you know, you're just like, it's just a question of time.
Well, you know what? You're spot on, because the next wave of great athletes that will play in the NBA, again, very progressive, they have set up shop on the continent. Yeah. And I can promise you within the next 3 years, you will hear a player who was born and reared in Africa being called in the first 5 to 6 picks of the NBA draft. They have gone full bore. it's almost like their surge when they decided to take their game to Europe. And now we see so many players from Croatia and Serbia and different other countries who have had a significant impact. We're going to see that same thing from the continent of Africa.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And you know, we have a whole bunch of questions to ask you about the NFL, but before we before we jump over to that, I want to just continue a little bit on the Black female athlete issue for a second. So this year, some of our superstar Black female athletes, such as Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles, prioritized their mental health above the needs of their sports organizations and sports fans. Both faced great backlash. And I'm just curious, how unusual was the choice they made to prioritize themselves? And ultimately, how do you think that's going to impact the sports?
Well, I think it really opened up a door that was closed for so long. You know, athletes dealing with mental challenges. That doesn't make them insane or crazy or whatever you want to call it. But you know what? The stress that they endure to perform at a high level all the time. And we talk about a couple of sports where you start so young, and most of them burn out by 23, 24 years old, if they can last that long. And I think with the undue pressure that's put on these athletes, especially in the individual sports, they just call time out and say, hey, hold on, enough is enough. They're fortunate to have the finances to sit this out until they have a comfort level. You know, in the past, you have to think about all the women who were on the tennis circuit or played golf or some of the other individual sports where there was no money to be made. They had to have a second job, especially if you were trying to qualify for the Olympics. Maybe they threw you a couple of extra crumbs, but they didn't make the kind of money that these kids make today from endorsements and all the other things that come into play. In tennis, the prize money alone is outstanding. So they are the first generation to be able to step up and call time out on their terms. And I think there's some undue criticism. I don't think people who've had this happen to a family member or someone they know, when it comes to that mental stress that they deal with, if you haven't experienced it, sometimes they'll say, oh, you're a wuss, or come on, suck it up, or whatever. But it's amazing when you're a person of color, it's a big story.
Right.
When you don't look like Osaka or Simone, you know, well, you know, she's just need a little downtime. She's going to be okay. You know, don't worry about it. But they hung out Osaka to the point where if I was her, I would say, hey, see you. I got 55 million in the bank.
Well, the
the
USTA hung her out to dry.
They did. And this isn't the first time. You know, I got a real problem with how the USTA handles business, because they have, in my opinion, mistreated a lot of women of color on the tennis circuit. The one young lady from Chicago, I can't think of her name, Taylor, you know, they gave her issues about her weight. And her mother was like, all right, we'll take our ball and go home. We'll deal with our own qualification. We'll qualify on our own. And then here comes McEnroe and all the crew. Oh, no, we want you to be part of this. Bull. You know what? And they call those parents stage mothers or stage parents. Hey, they're looking out for their kid. And I don't blame them, especially in an individualized sport. So for those women to call time, I commend them. And Michelle, I don't think they'll be the last. And you know what? I think it's okay. Now, we're going to have some that'll slip through the wire because, you know what? I'm struggling because I'm not very good. We'll have a few like that. But I think the ones who really have talent have now found, I think these two have been beacons for the future as far as how we deal with mental illness. And, you know, one of the other things they should be doing, these associations should provide more counseling. Sports therapy is what I would call it, because these athletes make them a lot of money, and they should make sure they try and help and protect them get through the rigors of a schedule, the wins, the losses, the injuries, and everything else that comes with it, along with media scrutiny. I think these associations should be more unified in bringing more professionals to come in to be available to them, to talk to them and make sure they're getting the proper treatment.
Yeah, instead of just exploiting them until you can't.
Exactly. Rolling that, shrugging their shoulders, rolling their eyes, waiting to see who the next 12-year-old is going to come out.
Right, exactly. I'm going to come back to the reaction you've been hearing from fans, but I I just can't, I got to jump into the NFL stuff. I can't wait.
Go for it.
You were speaking previously about the league presidents doing a lot to help change attitudes. And I want to talk for a second about Emmanuel Acho and his, the former NFL player, and his series of short videos called Difficult Conversations with a Black Man. And in one show, he had Roger Goodell come to the show, and they had to talk about the Colin Kaepernick situation. And I think that's the show where Goodell admitted that he was wrong. But at the end of the day, Kaepernick is still out of the league, right? And no one is jumping up and down to see if they can revive or rescue his career. So I'm wondering why the NFL in particular is so resistant to long-term change in their response to racism within the sport.
Well, I think you have to look at the owners. The owners run this league. Roger Goodell is he's a messenger compared to the other leagues where, you know, the owners push harder than he can push back. And that's unfortunate. You know, with regard to Colin Kaepernick, you know, that ship has sailed. You know, his career is over. And they didn't do him right. They came up with various excuses, but this was ownership. I mean, you know, you think about some of the owners in this league who've been outspoken about other political issues and who they supported politically. And it's no surprise that Colin Kaepernick was, for lack of a better term, blacklisted. Where we go from here, I don't know. I still think the NFL is light years behind the other sports with regard to dealing with its members. You think about a sport where your shelf life is less than 4 years. You know, 75% of the players 5 years after they're out of the game are either broke and or divorced. And the mental and physical toll that this game takes on your body is something you can't get back. And yet they have the worst benefits. They have the worst pension. They have no guarantees. And these guys go to war. You know, what blew me away in this most recent negotiation, when this is a sport that guys needed more certainty, more guarantees, instead of trying to reduce the workload, let's add another game. How about that? Let's add another game and see if we can break it down even more. And, you know, none of these guys get to a point where they're vested, where they have legitimate time in the league. And I fought leadership on both sides of that fence. I fought DeMaurice Smith for not being more aggressive to give these guys a chance. Right now, all those players are a control number to the union. As far as the NFL is concerned, they just, hey, look, man, there's somebody else coming out of college here in another year or so. I mean, this is the true use me up sport. And when you talk about why they haven't addressed things more, that's because the ownership mentality is such that that's all they know and that's all they want to know. They don't have to worry about minor leagues. They don't have to worry about anything else. You know what? They just go out and pick somebody up from Auburn or Alabama or whatever, let him run himself in the ground. 4 years later, they got somebody else doing the same job. They never miss a beat.
Yeah, you know, and it's the idea of not having good benefits and not having certainty takes us sort of around to the Philip Adams story from last week, where Philip Adams killed 6 people and then himself. And, you know, in the autopsy, they find out he had a CTE in both frontal lobes. Right?
Yeah, stage 2 CTE.
Yeah, which we know is caused by traumatic injury to the brain, and which our NFL players are increasingly experiencing. And then you combine that with the fact that the NFL was doing race norming, you know, so tell us a little bit about race norming and how that all fits in with the whole CTE discussion.
Well, you know, they had their little questionnaire, and, you know, as they were trying to go through the settlements on who they were going to pay and how much, they had some what you call trick questions to see if you qualified. And what I mean by qualified not to get paid. And it was so biased in how they went about it that the guys who ended up getting money, they got pennies. They got pennies for everything they've gone through, with no chance of recovering any more money down the road. It was to the point, if you recall, the judge in that case threatened to throw it out. He wouldn't accept the offer. He wouldn't accept the deal because he saw it be so one-sided. Then to come to find out later that maybe some of the lawyers who allegedly were working for the players had a side deal with the owners. So I mean, it reeked. It had a bad smell to it from day one. And these players, and Phillip Adams is one of many. This is one that we saw on the front page. There are a lot of guys who have turned to drug abuse, alcoholism, domestic abuse, can't keep a job, and the mood swings and all the other things. Plus, as John Madden once said, and Ray, you may remember this, he said the first time you put your hand on the ground in the NFL, your body's never the same. These guys will wake up sore and broken down, and the multiple surgeries that they've had. When you think about all those guys who played on that first layer of AstroTurf and what it devastated their bodies from the waist down, back and hip problems, knee replacements, ankle and foot surgeries, because they may as well have been playing on concrete because nobody spoke up for those players. They just wanted them to play a game. Now they have them out here running on ground up rubber, like that's going to make it better. And it doesn't. I mean, the players in the NFL have not figured that out, that the only people who care about them are their families. And maybe in some cases, as long as you're playing, you'll have a family. Once you're out of the game, that can change as well.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky. So it's a brutal sport. I get it. But it's one that has so many pitfalls to it that you just wonder what the next generation is going to look like as far as football. And I personally think that the game is going to have to change even more, because it's just a matter of time before we have a casualty on the field, or we have someone who's younger, more well-known and respected, that goes out early because of all the things that they had to deal with playing football.
Yeah, we had a previous episode with the Harvard doctors, the Harvard team that is studying them.
Wait a minute, you mean Princeton people have Harvard on the show?
Well, one of the doctors was from Princeton, so
okay.
we try to mix it up.
That's right.
But
one of the doctors did his undergrad at Princeton, Mike, so chill out.
Okay, so there's the olive branch there. I guess you were extending to your Ivy League colleagues. Okay, I got you.
But the studies that they're doing and the information that they're uncovering about the just the tragic situation that these former players are facing health-wise was, completely shocking. And again, you're right. The ones who had families left, were the ones who seemed to be doing better, but a lot of them experienced all those problems, and they were just living in unhappy states.
And they get downtrodden. As I mentioned, it's hard for them to find work. Their families are concerned about them, and the mood swings. You have to remember, these guys made a living running in and beating up people, okay? And the only thing they know is violence. And sometimes it gets, now that you can't play anymore, the next step could be severe. And I really concern myself with a lot of these guys who we've seen who are badasses on the field, and you run into them, or as I always say, he qualifies to be on Real Sports with Brian Gumbel, because they can always find a story like that of somebody you remember just playing 3 or 4 years ago, and now he's indigent, he's broke, his health has gone bad, and he can barely talk or barely remember his name, and it's just so unfortunate to see things unravel. I was out the other night, and this person should go nameless, who had a very good career in the NFL and had an even better career after his NFL playing career, who is dealing with CTE. And, you can just see the deer in the headlight look that he has, and you can see it. There's some things that makes him grin and other things that make him frown. And it's just so disheartening, because I knew this person is a mountain of a person. And all of us as friends are trying to keep an eye on him, because here's the sad thing about this. There are no CTE survivors, okay? It's kind of like Alzheimer's, where if you have a cancer patient, hey, I had cancer, I beat cancer. But there's no survivors from CTE. There's no survivors from Alzheimer's and dementia. And until you see it firsthand, or it happens to a family member, you have no idea the impact it can have on that individual and family members and friends. And the teams don't care. The teams don't care. They bring you out at halftime, give you a jersey, pat you on the head, and say, see you. And that's it.
they'll give you gift certificate to the local steakhouse. You know?
Exactly. Yeah. But sign this while you're there, though. Sign
That's
some
right.
autographs.
That's right. That's right. Well, so staying with football, Mike, and the impact that head coaches, can have on teams and its players and the league and everything. This whole incident with John Gruden and his letters between him and Allen on the Washington football team, where he used racist and misogynist language and everything. Let's face it, that goes on every single day, all across the league, and not just for football, okay? But in your travels, have you heard complaints about racism coming from coaches, in particular, and assistants, with players themselves, and how do they manage that dynamic? I mean, how do they create an impact on a coach to help him maybe understand what it is that it's like being a Black football player in the NFL?
Well, it's a good question, because I think there's a difference between the Black football player and the Black basketball player. And more importantly, you can't tell me that over 650,000 emails and messages that were looked into, that John Gruden was the only one who had something to say that got him fired.
No.
Come on. It's
Definitely
the thing
not.
is, I think that since the death of George Floyd, there's been more conversation, because coaches are creatures of habit. They don't have time to look up out of the manhole or the foxhole to find out what's going on in the rest of the world. So they get information second and third hand. Players are in a similar boat during the course of the season. So when the Floyd issue came about and there were protests, and I think you had more conversations, you saw maybe a little bit more unity. Now, with that said, these guys are professionals, okay? They can get you fired, and they can, as a player, you can get a guy coach fired a lot quicker than what you used to.
Mm-hmm.
So coaches have tried to embrace what's going on, but also make sure they keep their eye on the ball. One of the things about the NFL, if you notice, very few assistant coaches speak publicly during the course
Mm-hmm.
of the week. You might have a coordinator speak up, but you don't see the tight ends coach or somebody who may be working hand to hand with a player. That doesn't happen anymore. So basically, you're getting the opinions of 30 guys, 30 head coaches, and there's a whole lot more guys who probably have a comment, but you know what? They're trying to move up the ladder, and they don't want to step on a bouncing Betty landmine. So they just kind of keep their head down and keep on about their business.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there has been some issues that have taken place in how a player has been evaluated. When you're white, boy, he's got a high motor. Boy, this guy, he's gutsy. He plays hard, the whole 9 yards. And the guy next to him is playing just as hard. He said, boy, you know what? If he wouldn't take it down off all the time, he'd be even better player. What do you mean? This guy got more tackles than the other guy. So, but it also comes from perception, because the coaches will talk to, and Ray, you've been in the room countless days where coaches will talk to broadcasters.
More than I can remember.
And give them catchphrases and give them dog whispers on evaluating a player, be it white or Black. And then that announcer or that writer takes it from there, and then he adds a little salt and pepper to it, and then all of a sudden we have a description of an athlete.
Right.
And it's not right, but it's something that we see. Now, on the college front, I think that's a little different, because coaches have to deal not only with players, but parents sometimes get involved. And with the transfer portal, I think you really have to be careful in how you tread these days about social issues, because you know what, and I think I listen to a guy like Dabo Swinney, who I like as a football coach. Don't think my kid's going to ever play for him, because I think Dabo is one of those guys who thinks this is still, the 1960s about how players should be treated. And, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. And there's some coaches who don't get it. Then you have other coaches who do get it and keep their ear to the ground, and they do pay attention, and they ask questions. How are things going in your community? And we had a coach at the University of Missouri. His name was Gary Pinkel. who sided with his players when they were going to protest. You know, he said, hey, you don't want to play? We're not going to play. Anyway, he had a routine where every week he met with many of his black players and asked them, how are things going in the classroom? How are you dealing with things in the community? You know, how are you being treated in restaurants? Are you having problems with the police department? What are things that I can help you address? I don't know how many coaches do that, but I got news for you. I thought it was a real stand-up job on his part because he knew that 99% of those kids that play for him were going to be doing something else other than playing football on Sundays. And he tried to prepare them for life after football by making sure he was socially engaged. Now, maybe he didn't agree with everything that they were doing or saying or how they combed their hair or whether they had a tattoo or not. You know, those things are insignificant. It's about how you're being treated because those are his kids.
Right.
I think the NFL looks at it completely different.
Yeah.
Well, and just to show you where this is all going now, right? So college football now is all in a tizzy, right? Because Dion Sanders grabbed the #1 football recruit in America. Okay, kid plays defensive back and wide receiver. Okay, and also quarterback. He can do any. As he said, I can play any position on the football field, right? Probably except being a kicker. But it is now going to change the game in terms of the big schools that could always get the top flight, especially black athletes, right? That now, you know what, Dion Sanders is coaching this team. I think I'm going to go there. I think I'm going to play for an HBCU, you know, and be there for 4 years or whatever. And so now the major college programs, they got to figure this stuff out.
Well, there's a couple of things that go with that. And I went to a HBCU, and here was the loophole in that whole situation, where he was committed to Florida State, but the name and likeness laws in Florida compared to Mississippi was more lucrative for him to be in Mississippi than the state of Florida.
Right.
Ironically, they changed the law the day after the signing date took place. So they missed it by a day. So name and likeness puts HBCUs at the table now because, you know, black people write out checks to the old state university. And, you know, sometimes there's a comfort level. And I think what Dion has been able to do is show, you can come here and you're going to be treated fairly and you're going to have a chance to play. You're going to get exposure. You know, there was a time, and Ray, you remember, well, I'm going to go somewhere where I can be on TV. Well, everybody's on TV now.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
You know, so that you can't use that one anymore. So I commend Dion. We see now Hugh Jackson is going to Grambling. Eddie George is coaching at Tennessee State.
State.
You know, but the bigger issue here is, why did those guys have a crack in a larger university?
Yes.
And so here was the kicker though. Dion, everybody thought Dion should have the Florida State job. And they were like, well, we didn't think he's ready. Well, you're right. He wasn't ready to coach your team. He was just ready to take your best player from you.
Right.
You know, and I think that's something that everybody's got to pay attention to.
Right.
But you go back to the NFL. I think the NFL Old Boy Network is one of the most racist, antiquated items in professional sports and how they assess coaching candidates. You know, the Rooney Rule, they just basically look the other way. They go out and they hire a guy, they give him 3 years when everybody else gets a second and third chance. You know, we've been banging on the NFL tonight, rightfully so, I might add, because they don't have it together. But I think we're going to see more coaches that are going to take on this opportunity. And the states where the name and likeness laws, because like in Georgia, the state gets more of that money than you do. So, you know, it's state by state on how this works. And if you're like at Alabama or one of these big schools that really recruits and you have the resources, you better be getting to your legislator and saying, hey, look, we need to make sure we can do this, this, and that if we want to continue to compete. And if you don't think so, when do you come up for re-election again? We'll make sure everybody knows because, you know, football fans vote too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not about boosters anymore,
Right,
Mike.
right,
Oh, no,
right.
no, no.
And that takes us
No.
to the Urban Meyer question, right? Because talk about a college coach who forgot he wasn't at college anymore. Urban Meyer gets this job that he's not, well, in my opinion, may not have been qualified for, to coach in the NFL with the Jacksonville Jaguars, and he has to get fired because he ends up with a 2-11 season. And he's like,
Oh, that's just the beginning. That's the tip of the
yeah,
iceberg.
yeah, yeah, I get it, I get it. And he was the second, I think the second college coach this year that jumped into the NFL. And so, you know, as you say, we have all these talented Black folks who can be professional coaches in the NFL, and they never get the opportunity, not at the NFL and not at the big college level either.
Well, here's the thing, and they kind of use this against us. When these coaching opportunities become available, the good assistant coaches are coaching in postseason. And, you know, you can't hire a guy, you know, in postseason. You know, you got to wait for a season to be over with. And we saw that with the college situation because, you know, when the Notre Dame job became open, you know, a lot of people thought, well, you know what, maybe Eric Bieniemy might want to take a look at that, or USC. You know, he's from
Right,
California, but he couldn't take it because A, he was in season, and B, he's going to be on a good playoff team. And, you know, by the time he becomes available to be interviewed, you know, these teams have already moved on. So we got to figure out a way to make that a little bit more, we got to level that playing field. Now, with that said, you got some other guys out there who maybe deserve a second shot. You know, you got some coaches who coach in the NFL that probably, Raheem Morris is a guy that comes to mind. He should get another look. I look at Jim Caldwell, who was a really good coach in Indianapolis, and they haven't had a winning season since he left Detroit. Throw in Brian Leftwich, who was a really good player in college at Marshall. I think it was Marshall, and was a good quarterback. He had some injuries that slowed him down. Tom Brady talks about this guy like he's Sid Gilman. I mean, he's been that good of an offensive coordinator. So, you know, we got to get more guys in the system. There's a lot of good coaches, but the problem that we have with this is, and I touched on it earlier, we don't know a lot about them because they don't interview with the media. You know, head coaches would prefer to have one voice. So they don't really get a chance to talk. So you don't really get a chance to know them unless a player or a broadcaster brings his name up.
Well, but Mike, you know, the Rooney Rule is in place, right? If you don't enforce the rules that you create for diversity, then guess what? You're not going to get diversity.
Yeah, no, you're right. And you know what? They found loopholes with it. You know, it's kind of like I always tell people, you know, because they say you have to interview a person of color before you make a decision on. So, you know, that's kind of like Jerry Jones walking down the hall and he sees his running backs coach. Hey, you ever thought about being a head coach? Oh, yeah, I have. Okay. Well, I just talked to somebody. There he is. You know, and they document it. I mean, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for them to think we buy this yarn of BS. That, oh, yeah, we talked to him. You know, I'm trying to think of the guy that they interviewed right before Mike McCarthy. And they brought him in, or they talked to him, and they made him feel like he was actually in the hunt, and it was laughable. Now you have some coaches who've just said, you know what, I'm good because I'm not going to be part of this.
Right.
And and I always say, when you look at guys like this, anybody ever think about Mike Tomlin? Mike Tomlin's 35 years old. And somebody took a shot at him, and look at what he's done now. And still one of the most respected coaches. And you can't tell me that there aren't more Mike Tomlins on a tree out in the backyard.
So we've talked about players, we've talked about coaches, we've talked about owners and leagues. Let's wrap it up with your assessment of how the sports radio fans are responding to some of the changes that we've been talking about that are coming up in all across the various leagues.
Well, that's, you know, sports talk radio has gone through a little bit of a transformation where you don't take as many phone calls. It's more banter, text messaging, but it's the same 5% of people. You know, it's the same guys who have their own radio nickname that call in a show or text or whatever, and they've got their mind made up. And that's unfortunate because people of color don't have a chance to be part of a morning drive or a midday show where they actually have a more bigger audience. You know, we got the sundown shift, as I call it, you know, where you go on in the evening or at night. And at one point that was cool. But now, if you're a sports fan, you're either at the game or watching the game. You're probably not in your car. You're probably not sitting around the radio, around the kitchen table at home. So that person doesn't have a chance to get his voice out there. I think sports talk radio is at a real crossroads when it comes to African Americans being involved. If you're not a former player, they really don't have any use for you. I mean, think about how many people of color actually host shows. You know, he's always the Tonto of a radio show. You know, he's never the main guy. And you know, and that's from program directors who don't feel like we're qualified, which I think is not true. I mean, you know, I've been doing this for 40 years, and I've seen a lot of guys who just throwing their hands up, say, you know what, man, I don't need this. You know, I look at some TV outlets who don't have people of color on their broadcast as a studio analyst, as a host or a co-host. You know, here in St. Louis, Valley Sports has not had a person of color for baseball or any other sport that they cover locally. They haven't had one in 20 years.
Wow.
There's something wrong with that picture.
Yes.
You can't tell me there wasn't a former player or some guy who went to Syracuse, where you know apparently that's where all the hot shots come from.
Yeah, well, apparently only people go to Syracuse that are in this business.
Yeah, right, exactly. So you know it's wrong, and I don't know what you do about it except call them out for it. You know, but when you're in a room, and Ray, you've been in this environment all your life, where you look around and nobody looks like you, and they get kind of matter of factly say, "What do you think?" Right after they've already made a decision.
Sure.
So, sports talk radio has had a significant impact on how we view sports and how we pay attention to it. And I'll tell you something. The other thing about sports talk radio, especially for the NFL, it's changed our pattern of viewing and support, because anytime you hear a guy on the radio grousing about a player and he starts rattling off his numbers and talking about what he's done, you know, in the last 4 games and this, you know what? He's on his fantasy team.
Yeah.
So we don't root for teams, we root for players.
Right.
And if your guy disappoints you, now you trash him, and you know, on the radio. So we even have a different approach in how we view games, because some guy has got a guy on his fantasy team that bombed it over the weekend.
Yeah. And you know, betting with companies like DraftKings, FanDuel.
That's another thing.
That's a whole nother show.
That's a whole other show. But
yeah.
So
well, it's here. It's here to stay. Because, you know, think about this. If you look back at sports over the years, they've always tried to find new revenue streams. First, it was let's all get a good TV deal. Then it was let's build a stadium. Oh, we need luxury boxes. Then it became now it's gambling. Everybody's involved in gambling. You know, there was a time where, if you remember, and Ray, you're old enough to remember when Bowie Kuhn wouldn't let Willie Mays work
Mike.
as a greeter. Well, I'm the same. Well, I'm not that old, but my point being,
everybody knows Ray is old.
Bowie Kuhn wouldn't let Willie Mays work as a greeter at a casino.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
You go to a ballpark now, that's all you see as far as advertising. Now, some people will say, well, you know, times are changing, and I get that, and I certainly understand it. But I think that when you look at the impact, we're always looking for new revenue streams for owners. And so now gambling will be next, followed by marijuana sales.
Yeah.
Let's wrap this up by looking at like one of the big pictures. In the Washington Post the other week, there was an article about looking back at all these social activist protests post George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the commitments that corporations and companies were going to make to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And financing, you know, people, what have you. And the Washington Post article basically said that hasn't happened, okay? The commitment that all these companies and corporations made, we don't see any changes in the hierarchy structure in these companies and corporations. So tell me, is it the same with sports overall, professional sports, or are they a little bit further ahead of the curve because of some of the leagues that we talked about in this episode?
Well, I think the NFL is going to always be near the end of the bus on this. I'm kind of a guy who looks back at the Cleveland Summit in the 60s with Jim Brown and Kareem. Those guys had a plan. Hey, we're going to build from within, and then we'll have a seat at the table. But we have to be unified and do business from within before we can take our product out and get the respect that we deserve. I think we have to make them accountable. I think that we have to have a compliance officer that says, oh, Coca-Cola, you said you were going to do what? Well, check's not in the mail yet. Haven't seen it. You're going to get involved in this. You're going to do something for this guy's foundation. Oh, wait a minute. We're going to take a picture together, and then everybody gets to believe that we're all good, and then we never hear from them again. So I think that there should be a watchdog group to get involved in making these companies and these leagues compliant upon some of their promises and their commitments that they had stated during a time of strife and struggle where they would be put on blast. Well, they haven't seen blast yet until we find out what they actually haven't done. So I would think that would be something I would wholeheartedly support, someone in compliance. And maybe it's a university that puts together a department, a political science department of some sort, that could come up with a group of individuals nationwide, and they all kind of get involved in finding out who said what and what were their intentions, work with some of these athletes and their foundations as well, and other foundations that teams are providing, and making sure that these people step up to the plate and actually be counted.
That's a wonderful idea. And
Michelle, you got nothing going. You're retired,
I'm retired now. Maybe I'll
there
get
you go.
That.
She's my first nominee.
Yeah. Because,
I agree with. Hey, Michelle, it's only going to be 40 hours a week.
Hey, I'm a hard worker. But when corporations get into trouble with securities regulations or whatever, we look to their compliance departments to see, what's your plan? How are you monitoring? And are you effective at doing that? So I think it's a great idea.
Now, the challenge that you have is how close will the leagues want to be involved with this, because these are their advertisers and they don't want to get too close to a situation where somebody welches on a statement. So it's got to be somebody who has, no oars in the water. They've got to have somebody who's objective. This isn't to expose people, because if they do the right thing, they should deserve that credit too.
Right.
But the ones who do a lot of lip service, then you know what, they need to be called out, and then we'll let the advertisers or their customers make a decision on how important it is, because none of them likes bad press. So I think I'd start with that, and then we'll see where it goes.
Well, Mike, first of all, I'm so glad that we got you on, man, because you and I have been talking about stuff like this for a couple decades now, and now we finally made it happen.
We both had more hair.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, we had Tito Jackson froze and everything.
That's it,
now
man.
look at us now, man.
That's it. Well, Michelle and I want to really thank you for making yourself available, man, for our final show of the season.
Well, you know what? It's an honor to be on with you guys. We have some mutual friends, and the thought of you having me come on is heartwarming for me, and it kind of rounds out the year 2021 for me to be part of this show, and hopefully we'll do this again.
Definitely.
I'm always around. I'm like a bad penny, man. I just turn up everywhere, man. So don't worry. I see your number, Ray, come up on my phone. I always take the call, bro. And Michelle, it's great to visit with you as well.
Nice
Some great conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and may you guys have a great, safe holiday.
You too.
And good luck on the bag recovery, Ray. Maybe I'll get you one for the holiday.
There you go.
Well,
the third day of Kwanzaa, don't be surprised to see a bag knocking on your door.
I'll send you a link, okay, to me. How about that? Well, Michelle, I hope you appreciated my buddy, lifelong partner in this industry, Mike Claiborne. He's really got a wealth of knowledge, and I always enjoy having a chance to speak with him.
No, that was great. And, it's a gift to our listeners who are sports fans. I hope they enjoyed the talk and got something out of it. And of course, Ray, this is the end of our season, as you say.
I can't believe it. It's 3 years now, Michelle, right? But remind me if I'm wrong.
It's three seasons, 2
Yeah.
years.
Okay.
And we've got almost 20 episodes up online.
At
Not
least.
quite 20, but close. Yeah.
At least. And I tell you what, this has been a blessing. I mean, this was all born out of the friendship of the Tigresses, and you guys allowed me in. And I have to say, especially coming up on this holiday season, that I'm blessed to have you guys in my life. And I just want to wish everyone out there, all of our listeners and our families, a really wonderful and happy holiday season.
Yes, ditto on that. And we look forward to seeing you in 2022, which hopefully will have less COVID.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Listen,
and we're
much more sneezes and sniffles, but no COVID.
Yes, well, it's not going to be none because people just won't, do what's right. But hopefully it will be less. And we're looking forward to having some wonderful shows in our season 4. So we want to make sure everyone has a safe and happy holiday season. And we'll see you when we get back. If you enjoyed what you heard today, visit our website, NubianTigersPodcast.com. In addition to the podcast, we also post a resource page for each subject to provide additional sources of information. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @NubianTigers, written as one word. We're also on YouTube on the Nubian Tigers podcast channel. Our podcast is hosted by Anchor FM, but if you have a favorite podcast app, we're probably on it. Just look for the Nubian Tigers Talk. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge with you next time.
Wake up, wake up, wake up.